All right, and as mentioned, what we're going to be discussing is international business and what some of the multinational companies are doing to ensure that they stay afloat given the kind of conditions that we're in right now. And I'm going to start off maybe with Churchill Sauke, who's a governance consultant with me in studio. And Churchill, maybe just to get an overview of what your take is so far, given that, of course, looking at, COVID-19, it's taken everybody by surprise, but that does not mean we do not plan. Churchill.
Well, thanks, Mike. The COVID-19 has found the world in and it's put the world in quite a limbo. And specifically, when you look at the impact on business and the impact on multinational corporations and, the impact on the global chain, the global supply chains, it's had a huge impact. Transportations have been cut off, and so that means that businesses have been stopped. So we cannot underestimate the impact that COVID-19 has had on business, and we can also not underestimate the fact that post this pandemic, businesses will have to re-strategize and countries will have to re-strategize on their investment, on their investment, and the whole idea of global trade will also have to be redefined. And as you know, that multinational corporations, of course, have had a huge impact in terms of enhancing and promoting globalization and global trade. And the idea of free trade has really been promoted by the multinational corporations. Mm-hmm. And I think that post the pandemic, there is really going to be rethinking as to how do companies make themselves much more resilient to future pandemics.
All right, and we're also joined by a video link by Taj Bedi. Taj Bedi is the Chief Executive Officer of TWC, which is the wine company. Thank you for joining us this morning, Taj. And of course, TWC having its foothold in several African countries and being a multinational. Maybe let's start by how are you managing as a company to ensure that you stay afloat?
Thank you for having me. Look, I think COVID has affected probably every corner of the world. We've hit 2.5 million people who've been confirmed positive. What we're looking to do is mitigate the problems that have come as a result of COVID, mainly supply chain disruption and the severe destruction of demand that we've seen as a result. What we've chosen to do is form a strategic alliance with the third largest spirits company in the world, Beam Suntory, and they've appointed us as the exclusive agent for the East African market. And for us, Beam Suntory is a very big move because they're a company that has a revenue of $5 billion. Their mother company, Suntory Holdings, has a $20 billion revenue, and we feel representing their brands will help us come out of this issue with COVID bigger and better. Something else we've also focused on is increased digitization. Today you can find our products available on over 15 online and e-commerce platforms, which historically we've not attributed a lot of resources towards that. We really want our product to make its way to the end consumer, whichever way possible. And with the destruction of HoReCa and on-trade, there is been a bit of a spike in off-trade sales. But we feel the main factor that could help us fill in the gap is through online. So it's forced us to ramp up online business models. Something else we've had to embrace is technology. I think in today's day and age, it's not bricks and mortar. You don't need to physically be in an office to get work done. So, utilizing mobile meeting apps, virtual offices, file sharing, it's all ways of helping us continue to run operationally. You can sometimes get in a rut of firefighting when these situations happen, and you tend to kind of not particularly focus on moving the business forward. So I think a combination of looking at tomorrow, digitization, of course, new supply chain and disruption in terms of how to mitigate, and also just embracing technology is something we're looking at to help overcome this.
Taj, sorry to interrupt you. I know one of the things that has probably hit your company like any other is, financially, there's a huge drop in revenue, even in terms of just normal transaction, despite the fact that you're still trying to embrace technology. How have you buffered that as a multinational?
So for us, as I said, it's the key is looking at tomorrow, forming the strategic alliances we have. A lot of people would say, why are you shopping around for new principles at a time where demand is so low? and the market is not what we're used to. And like I said, the key focus point here is how can we look at benefiting tomorrow? How can we remain relevant? The world will continue after COVID, and we don't want to be playing catch up. So it's important we use this time to sit back and strategize, look at the big picture. You've obviously got less operations going on, so your senior management team can sit back and think, look, these are where we want to be. This is our 1-year plan, our 3-year plan, our 5-year plan. And we think the appointment of Beam Suntory brands within the market will help us increase our revenues, create jobs as well. We anticipate around 300 jobs to be created regionally as we represent the company. And so for us, yes, revenues have gone down. There is a fine line between managing your costs and also your revenue drivers. Because cash flow is king, and obviously when you need to remain liquid at times like this and sit on cash buffers. So for us, it's really, there's very little we can do now. We can look at alternative distribution methods, which we're trying to do, try and cut costs where we can. But I think the key is focusing on tomorrow and how we can come out of COVID without playing catch up. And when things normalize, we're in a position to press play and continue operating the way we have.
I'll come back to you in just a bit, Taj, but let me come to you, Churchill. And obviously, multinationals are giving us an example in terms of leadership of how we should be operating. Do you feel like in Kenya we have that capacity to plan ahead and look at the future as opposed to looking at now?
Well, I think this is a wake-up call, and I think to, like any other nations, you see the industrialized countries have also been found off guard. We as a country as well, this is actually a wake-up call for us to rethink on how we can be able to, on how our companies can be able to become resilient of such pandemics in future. And I'm happy that one of the things that my colleague is highlighting, which is very important, is investment in e-commerce. And when you look at the one of the things that has not been hugely affected with this pandemic is the idea of information through the internet. I mean, the supply of goods is still on through, other than the online platform. So this is an opportunity that many of the businesses can be able to hugely invest on. Of course, this will require a redefinition of value principles, because the moment you're investing in e-commerce, there has to be values of honesty, accountability, so that you are able to create a philosophy, a company philosophy where your clients, however far they are, they can be able to trust. They can be able to trust your business model. The idea, the other thing is the questions about investment in technology, automation, and robotics, especially when you're looking at production and manufacturing. This is another aspect that maybe companies could look up to. Of course, there is the other flip side of the impact of automation and robotics in terms of it affecting employment and, having employment being taken up by robots and things like that. We've seen a lot of these in Japan, countries like Japan that have hugely adopted that. But now for countries like ours, where we still are suffering from unemployment, in as much as companies may want to go that direction, we may need to be a little bit careful, because it might affect employment. The other key thing that as we get into technology that companies will have to look at is the issue of cybersecurity and security as a whole. Because of intellectual property rights, it will make us much more vulnerable to our ideas being taken up. And when you're meeting online, how secure are you, for example, these virtual platforms? How secure are you that you are not giving out very sensitive information to people who are not supposed to get them? So these are things that companies, as we move forward, we may need to think about. And the other thing that I think will be very key is that companies, we might need to rethink about creating safety nets that for future pandemics that we do not know. Because, this pandemic has made us see the power of what a pathogen can be able to do, and that however much we invest in military arms, we are still not secure. So then companies may need then to seek their own survival mechanisms by creating their own safety nets in terms of mechanisms that can be able to help them sustain themselves in scenarios when pandemics arise.
All right, Taj, coming back to you, and COVID is obviously teaching us a new way of doing things, and we're now talking about the new normal. For companies, what advice would you give? Because it looks like there's some things we may not go back to. For instance, just the working space that we have always traditionally gone to work through. COVID-19 is teaching us that there are different ways that we can use technology to work. For us to deliver, you don't have to be in a certain office. Some of the lessons that possibly you're picking that we may not go back to.
Yes, so for me, I think the key is accepting the new normal. And the sooner we do that, the sooner we'll be able to adapt and the sooner we'll be able to move forward. I think it's a matter of being proactive and not reactive. We obviously know what's happened and we obviously know the effect it's going to have on the economy, on the businesses, on the SMEs. And we need to really focus on running our businesses more streamlined. We need to keep our operations lean. We need to be flexible. We need to reduce our dependency on third-party imported supply chains, because when you have a global seizure of borders, as we've seen, it's very difficult to trade and get products in and out, and a lot of the trading businesses in Kenya, the SMEs, will of course be bearing the brunt of that. I think, as mentioned earlier, touching on to the new distribution chutes that will be created post-COVID will be definitely something that we need to embrace. Traditional distribution models and supply chains have been disrupted, will be disrupted going forward, and I think the key is to learn the lesson here. This is the first maybe of more pandemics to come. Obviously it caught us off guard, but if we can learn the lessons and think about now the way forward, I think we'll be in a much better place. So I think the key lessons are, take home. These things can happen. I think if we can vertically integrate, if we can automate, as my colleague said, there will be self-sufficiency going forward, and we just need to make sure we focus on that.
All right, you talked about liquidity, and of course that's important for any company to keep running. How are you managing your huge staff, particularly given that you're not in one country? I'm sure there are different dynamics for different countries. There are countries where you may be, where there's a total lockdown. There's Kenya, where there's a partial lockdown. How are you managing your staff?
So we've sat down with all our staff and said, look guys, at the end of the day, you're all stakeholders in this company, so how can we look at streamlining our costs and getting more efficient? If certain outlets are closing, for example, the HoReCa market is completely shut down here, a lot of hotels, restaurants and bars are now closed. We've spoken with our employees and said, are there alternative markets we can look at? So for example, if we had certain trade representatives focusing strictly on hotel sales or restaurant sales, as I mentioned, that slumped, but we've had a massive spike in off-trade and retail sectors, maybe as a result in compensation. So we're redeploying our sales staff where we can in order to optimize their use. And as I mentioned, we're pushing quite aggressively on online platforms now. So we've got our sales team, in the market, going up to every online platform, e-commerce platform, saying, list our product, this is how we want to work with you. So it's really about trying to rehouse them and find where we can sweat them the most efficiently. As of yet, we've not sent home anybody because we're trying to accommodate everybody's needs and hope that the conditions do improve. And yeah, the best thing right now is to work as a team and to explain to our employees the problem and see how we can come up to an equitable solution for all parties.
All right, let me come back to you, Churchill. And of course, the uncertainty is one of the things that be it government, be it companies, be it employee, we are battling with, because nobody knows how long COVID will go on for. And like you've mentioned, the two of you have mentioned, this could just be in preparation for other pandemics, but that may come. What advice would you have to the workforce? Because one of the things, of course, we are likely to see is a huge spike in unemployment.
Well, I think it will require, companies to be a little much more innovative and seeking, going into frontiers that have not been exploited. And I think that broadening the market base and the client base through e-commerce will be something that will be very significant. And the other thing which of course might be of significance for companies, especially that are local or global, is the idea of localization of production. We might need to rethink of where do we do our manufacturing. And if in cases where we had companies that were local companies that were doing manufacturing outside of the borders, it might be necessary to rethink and localize those manufacturing and production. Because in doing so, then we will be creating much more jobs that can be able to help those who will be affected or those who will have been laid off by other companies to get jobs. So that idea of localization will be very key. Of course, it might might need certain aspects of government incentives to bring on board certain policy frameworks or policy environment that will make some of these companies to localize their production. The other thing that might be significant is relooking at the whole idea of the employment regulations, because in as much as the pandemics are there is also need to cushion the employees from layoffs by companies, which you have highlighted, and my colleague has highlighted very clearly, that actually there are companies that are actually going to realize that there are some positions that are redundant and they never needed them. How are we going to protect these people? How are we going to protect these employees? So over and above broadening production and broadening our profit margins in view of the pandemic, there is also needed to create a regulatory framework that will safeguard people who have been in employment but are likely to be rendered redundant by this pandemic.
All right, coming back to you, Taj, as a multinational and bringing in foreign investment into the country, what are the prospects you see for Kenya post-COVID-19, particularly because some of these plans, I'm sure, were in place well before we were hit by the pandemic, but that now may be changing things. Do you still see the same prospects?
Yes, look, I think post-COVID-19 we're going to see a couple of macroeconomic changes. There will be this peak globalization that we've become accustomed to in the last few years. I feel that's definitely going to shift away. I think supply chains are going to become a lot more localized, a lot more regionalized. I think there will be a lot of import substitution going on. As mentioned, with the closing of borders, it's not as easy to trade anymore, so people are going to become less reliant on imported supply chains. I think there could be an opportunity for foreign investment and multinationals to actually come in locally and invest in local production facilities for regions to ensure that they do not have such disruptions going forward in the event that such occurrences do happen. I do also think there will be a slight increase and resurgence in the manufacturing sector, predominantly because less imports or less reliance on imports will spur local demand, and local production will have to fulfill that demand. So I feel that will be something that's quite useful for the manufacturing sector. I think from our perspective, which is more of a trading business, we don't see this affecting us too much. We think the brands we represent will be actually quite resilient and will be well insulated against COVID. And the reason I say that is because if you're an FMCG company from the US or the UK and you want to set up an edible oil plant anywhere in the world, it's easy to do because the brands belong to you. But for us, we represent brands like Courvoisier, which is a cognac, or Hibiki, which is a Japanese whiskey. Those brands cannot be manufactured locally. They have to be made in the cognac region of France or in Japan, or a Scotch has to be made in Scotland. So we feel our brands will be well insulated and come out stronger based on their brand equity. But generally speaking, I think, yes, we will be a lot more localized and supply chains will follow that suit. I think our dependence on imports and imported supply chains will shift away, and countries will become a little more protectionist going forward. As we've seen in some of the Western markets, they've banned the export of PPE equipment, just as examples. So at the end of the day, you need to cater for your market first, and that will now be the priority.
All right, and Taj, maybe just to get your thoughts on the fact that, for instance, if we take Kenya as an example, we are more of a consumer company more than manufacturing. Is this time for us to literally introspect and begin to look at manufacturing and what we can produce locally as opposed to just importing almost everything?
100%. I think definitely we need to look at what can be made in locally. Buy Kenya, build Kenya is important. As I mentioned earlier, there are certain brands which we will never be able to produce locally based on geographical denominations and specifications and technicalities. So I think those niche sectors will continue to be traded, and I think it's important for them to be coming in because we do have a large tourism industry, and people coming into Kenya do want those specialized products. But I think from a manufacturing perspective, this is a good opportunity for us to revamp our sectors and see how we can invest in increasing our production, our output, and catering for the demand that we now have locally. We're very dependent on imports. I think $16 billion worth of imports every year. So I think we need to try and see how we can channel that business into our local country. And in doing so, manufacturing will be the only sector that allows us to create jobs. and considering the potential redundancies that will be looming post-COVID, it's more imperative now and essential that we all look at this from a government level, also from the financial services to support this. I think this is all a sort of team effort from all parties involved and all stakeholders to spur that economic growth, cushion the demand fallout, and just try and put us back on the map.
All right, Churchill, what incentives do you feel possibly government should give to manufacturers to encourage them? Because this for us really should be a turning point. It should be a point where we say, yes, we've been largely importing, but for instance, if we just use masks as an example, previously we'd probably have exported all the masks we have, but now we have manufacturers who've stepped up and decided to do that. So what incentives do you feel government would offer to ensure that manufacturers spur and ensure that we go back and spur growth?
I think that it would be very necessary for government to make people realize that whatever is produced locally is best fit for our local consumption. And one of the ways in which this can be done, and you have seen it the way the Minister of the CS for Industrialization has been able to do, is first to create an environment where the unfair competition with exports does not exist. Because, when we look at some of the products that we can be able to produce locally, in terms of quality, they might not necessarily at the beginning be able to compete with those that are imported. But even that being so, it is part of the process. We then need to protect our local products, and protect our local products by ensuring that the pricing of our products could be much less. And it could necessitate, for example, governments to reduce, for example, certain taxes on locally made manufactured products, so that they become a little more cheaper for people to buy. In that case, we will be having people going more for the local products. It might be necessary, although this might go against some of the norms of global free trade, to impose certain non-trade tariffs non-tariff barriers for some of the goods that we consider extremely essential that we need to produce locally. So these are some of the mechanisms that maybe government could be able to use to strategically ensure that local production is left for some of the key products that we consider very essential for our market. The other thing is to hugely and heavily invest in research and development in a manner that customizes and localizes our development and localizes our products in our context. I think for far too long, and this is on the broader context of the Africans, we have so far imported so much technology without contextualization of our, what we really need. And so this is the time for our governments to inspire leadership amongst our people to innovate and come up with products that are customized for our own use. So it will require stimulation through financial and tax incentives, and even just providing certain stimuluses for companies that are producing locally. The other thing is maybe to attract foreign direct investment through, having multinational corporations coming in to partner with our local industries. There's something that one of the members of parliament had highlighted, which I think was very important, about whenever there is a multinational corporation that is owned outside coming to invest in this country, they partner with the local companies so that there is transfer of technology, people's capacity are built. And then after some time, you realize that when those companies leave, we are left with the knowledge, and we are able to be self-reliant. And I think this is what China has been able to do. The other thing that will be very important is when you look at the way China was able to attract manufacturing, they looked at the whole concept of not just the idea of reducing production through cheap labor. They looked at other aspects of labor relations and reducing too much stringent conditions that make companies to expend too much or spend too much because of the requirements of the labor regulation. The other thing that made China to attract a lot of manufacturing was the idea that they put not too much stringent conditions on some other regulations like climate and environment. Well, these are things that might appear really against some of the global norms, but when we look at it, we might need to relax some regulations to make global institutions and global corporations to see the need to invest in this country. Okay. The idea about stability of infrastructure, especially with regards to certain things like power and electricity, will be very key to attract some of these corporations to come and invest within the country.
All right, and maybe same question, Taj. What incentives do you feel government should, put in place to ensure that we have a more manufacturer-friendly environment for even foreign investors to be able to build the capacity in Kenya?
I think, as my colleague touched on, the key is really stimulus. We need to, I think the government have already taken massive steps in helping the local industry. We've had reduction in income tax, we've had a VAT reduction, pay as you earn. So the burden they are trying to lift away from the industry and the private sector, which I think will definitely help. I think also reaching out to the financial sectors and asking them to hold the hands of the SMEs and generally avail credit. Generally reducing the CBR rate. So I feel these are all the right steps in terms of helping us insulate the damages. We're going to have the demand destruction, as I mentioned. So I feel it will be an effort the government will have to champion. And I feel they've already been doing that. If we look at the mask production, as you touched on earlier, we're working with KEBS and working with the relevant bodies. They have fast-tracked the standardization for certain products we didn't particularly have standards for historically. Which maybe previously could have taken a bit more time in terms of establishing what the norm should be for those products. So I feel it is a matter of speed, and speed literally will be what makes this work for us. So I feel they've already stepped forward. I feel it will continue to be a team effort amongst the government bodies, KEBS, KRA as well, and generally working with the financial institutions to hold the hands of everybody involved at this stage.
Okay, and I'll come back to you for your closing comments, but let me start with you, Churchill, your closing remarks and possibly what Kenyans should brace themselves for.
Thanks, Mike. I think that for me, this pandemic has given us an opportunity to rethink of our sovereignty and to think about our survival as a country in terms of how do we make ourselves self-reliant. It has given us an opportunity to relook at our overdependence on the international community and how much it has made us more vulnerable. And it is an opportunity for us to rethink how we can be able to make ourselves resilient. And as we have mentioned, we need to look at aspects of promoting local production. We need to look at aspects of promoting our made in Kenya, buy Kenya, build Kenya, and make it a brand that will be a mark of not just prestige, but a mark of nationalism that is embedded within our DNA. So this is an opportunity for us, and we got to grab it.
All right, Taj, your closing remarks and maybe just prospects that we should expect, and maybe also just touch on a bit of advice to business owners on how to keep afloat with this very, very unpredictable times.
So I think we all know economically we're in quite uncharted territory. We've never seen such a global pandemic, seizing of borders, homogeneous demand destruction. It's totally unprecedented. I think there is a fine line here between reopening the economy and letting us go back to normalcy, and obviously flattening the curve. And it's a very fine line, and we're literally treading on eggshells here. So we have to try and manage that intricate balance. What I do feel is, and something I'm a firm believer in, there is opportunity in crisis. So yes, we've been hit with something that we didn't expect. It's caught us all off guard. But the key take home for me will be there will be an opportunity in the crisis, and I think it's important business owners, anyone involved needs to think about what is that opportunity and how can we leverage off it so that in a world post-COVID, not only are we relevant, we've not been left behind and we're not trying to play catch-up. It's important to use this time strategically to sit back, think at a sort of bigger picture of where we want our businesses to go, how to streamline our businesses going forward, and learn the lessons. That's very important. We need to learn the lessons that we've seen as a result of COVID, so that tomorrow, if and when something along the lines similar or different has effects to us, we are ready. We're not caught off guard. We need to be self-sufficient. That is key. We need to be resilient. We need to focus on how to get out of this. And I feel this is the time now to look forward and not backwards.
All right, thank you very much, Taj Bedi, who's the Chief Executive Officer for TWC, that's the wine company, and also Churchill Sauke, who's the governance consultant. Thank you for joining us this morning, just to weigh in and see what prospects we are looking at, particularly internationally, when it comes to business. And remember the question that we've been asking you and would like to find out what your take is: what should African countries do to attract foreign investment after COVID-19 pandemic? What should African countries do to attract foreign investment after the COVID-19 pandemic? Of course, bearing in mind that every country right now is doing the best that they can do to ensure that they stay liquid and they keep their companies running. But as a nation, we also need to be proactive and ensure that we're looking at foreign investors and how they can be attracted to come into Kenya so that we can spur and build their economy. It's now 3 minutes after 8. We're going to take a short break right here on Morning Express, but do stay with us. We have more stories coming up on what's making headlines both locally and internationally. We take a break and we see you on the other side of the break.